Hello, and a very warm welcome to our audiences here in the Museum at King's College London, in the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and of course online. I'm Alison Duffy, I'm Director of the Cultural Institute at King's. Body Politic is our very first collaboration with Dance Umbrella and feels like a particularly apt starting point with such a varied and interesting panel in both London and New York debating such a key topic. Do enjoy your afternoon, that you'll participate both digitally and in person, and we really look forward to hearing what you think. I'm delighted to introduce Emma Gladstone, Artistic Director of Dance Umbrella, and Emma will say a few words about this afternoon's event and will also introduce our panel.
Thank you, Alison. So welcome. This is the first of a new series of talks that we're doing here at Dance Umbrella that will take place each year. They're focusing on issues to do with arts and culture. So they're not just about dance, but they're about dance in a wider arts context. And they're not just about our festival here in London, but about the UK and wider internationally. As part of that breadth, I'm really happy that we've got a panel that includes a filmmaker, a curator, a performer, a choreographer, as well as, who have I missed out? Someone I've missed out. A performer, sorry Julianne, we've got a good range there. So I think it will mean that we can hear an interesting range of perspectives on the topic as we dive in and the discussion unfolds both with you online and with our audience here at King's. Welcome. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Daniel Glaser. Dan is the director of the Science Gallery, which is part of King's College, and I will let him introduce the panel and we can start the talk. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emma. And hello, everyone. So we are in a funny configuration in the sense that I think there's nobody in the world who can see everyone who's joining in here. So just to kind of orientate you for those bits that I can see, for those of you out in Podworld, I guess you're probably over there or there, with no idea what you're doing. So behave, all right, and pay attention. We've got an audience here in London in King's College. Give us a wave, audience. Say hello. 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 Right, got a wave. An audience here just warming up. And we've got some panellists who I'll introduce here. We have panellists in New York at BAM, and we have people watching out in Podworld. And those of you who want to participate in Podworld, if you're on a PC, you can ask questions through the live chat window that's to the right-hand side of your screen. You've got to choose a nickname. I probably won't be able to see what your nickname is, so be bold. And then start chatting. If you're watching on a tablet or a mobile phone, you'll have to use the rather more antiquated form of Twitter to encounter the discussion. And the hashtag is BODPOL, BODPOL 14, BODPOL 14. So tweet us your thoughts, and Alice is sitting there and she's undertaken to summarise the entire intelligence of the Twitter sphere into pithy sentences which she's going to interject as we go. So we hope for an interactive discussion. And depending on where you are, it'll finish at 6:30 something. In London, 6:30. In New York, I think a little bit earlier than that. Right, so the speakers we've got, and I shall introduce them in the order that they will speak. Penny Woolcock, who's in the middle here, is a writer-director working across documentary fiction, opera and art installation. And she has a particular interest in marginalised communities. So we'll see how that plays through as we go. We've got Matt Fenton, who is the Artistic Director and Chief Executive at Contact, which is a leading national arts venue based in Manchester, England. And it places young people's leadership at the heart of the organisation. We've then got Kenrick Sandy. I said I wouldn't introduce him as Kenrick H2O Sandy, which is his full performer's name. And he's an award-winning choreographer and performer. You may have seen the Frankie and June Say Thanks, Tim segment of the London 2012 opening, was that correct? Opening ceremony? And subsequently a segment in the Sochi Olympics. In New York, hopefully, I mean I know they're there physically, and some of you may be able to see them as well. We've got Julianne Stanza, who's a professional dancer who began her career with the Minneapolis Children's Theatre and the Chicago Lyric Opera Ballet. But she's now with the Tanztheater Wuppertal Pina Bausch. I should have apologised in advance for my German pronunciation because it's going to be a barrier to the afternoon if you get hung up on that. Who are performing currently in New York. and we'll be talking about her experience there, especially with working with different kinds of participants for the work that she's been involved in. And finally, we'll hear from Simon Dove, who is in New York, but actually ran one of the first national dance agencies in the UK in Yorkshire, in Leeds, and was the founder and artistic director of Vivata, which is the first contemporary South Asian performance festival in the UK. And he's currently co-curating a festival called Crossing the Line in New York City, and I hope we're going to hear more about that in his remarks shortly. So, folks, I've asked them to keep to 3 minutes each. We'll see if they do. First of all, Penny Woolcock. And since we don't have a live audience, perhaps we should do the snapping fingers thing like we do in Blink 106 to welcome, because applause might be too loud. But
Well, I mostly make work that's rooted in the world rather than inside my head. And whatever the form of it, what I love to do is to go out onto the streets and then tell the stories of those who live on the margins, the kind of the people that we throw away. And what interests me as an artist is finding the best and most interesting ways of telling these stories, and that can often involve asking people to perform versions of themselves. So the work that emerges out of this is intended for the widest possible audience, and I'm not expecting people to make allowances for the fact that perhaps the performers are not professional. I want them to be judged in the way that any performer would. So I would make a distinction, which perhaps you guys might not agree with, between community work, which prioritizes process over the final piece, and where the final piece is only really intended to be of interest to the participants and people who know them. So I think community work's great, but it's not actually what I want to do. I just want to find the best way of telling whatever story it is. And generally, or very often, I think people are best at telling their own stories. So in documentaries, I go out, I spend long periods doing some sort of ethnographic research, immersing myself in other people's realities, and then I try and tell the best truth that I can about them. Now, this can be dangerous because, for example, when I'm trying to tell the best truth about young men in inner city gangs, that can confirm prejudices about violence and criminality, which may well be people's reality. But I believe that when people have a space in which they can articulate their own experience, it's empowering rather than demonizing. And when I'm there, I engage as myself. I give people my phone number. I become friends with some people. They come to my house, just as would happen when you work with anybody else. And I never do secret underground filming. So I try and make a space in which people can be their best and most authentic selves. So, for example, I made a film called One Day, which was a fiction about inner city gang life. And I cast people who were engaged in that world playing versions of themselves, and that was a fiction. And after that film was finished, a couple of the guys from the two main gangs, this was in Birmingham, the second largest city in this country, they asked whether I could help them to mediate a truce, because I was the only person that they knew, crazy as it is to be a white middle-class person from London, who knew people on both of the gangs and wasn't in the police. So that then turned into a documentary that followed and mediated a process, and nobody's been killed for 3 years. So when I'm directing fiction then, I'm not a fan of technical acting where you have to admire a very famous person pretending to be someone else and putting on a funny accent, and you think, wow, that's amazing, they're really good at pretending to be whoever it is. And I often prefer to avoid this, which is kind of a barrier to suspending disbelief, by casting first-time unknown actors. And I don't call this casting real people, because actors are real people, and first-time actors are acting, and acting is a gift, and I certainly can't do it. If you asked me to walk in front of that camera, I'd start doing pretend walking, because I'm not a performer. But I guess as a director, your job, or my job, is to draw out the most authentic performance that a person can give. And of course art changes the world and it changes people in it. So there have been people I've worked with who've gone on to have careers as actors. There have been other people who've left an abusive relationship because they suddenly realised that it wasn't normal for everybody. But it's not just them changing, it's me changing and all of us, because that's really what art can do, is it changes and transforms us in the best possible way. So very powerful.
Thank you very much, Penny. And, well, genuine jeopardy. I like the idea of you actually measuring the outcome of your work by the fact that there have been no killings in the place where you were filming since the film was made. Matt, follow on.
Hi. A lot of what Penny says has huge resonance and relevance for me. I'm a programmer and a curator, and I guess, therefore, in some ways, a kind of gatekeeper. I'm someone that's running an institution that is publicly funded. And I think over the last 10 years, I've started to ask some questions about that role, which is really around who gets to decide what art gets made, who decides who performs, on behalf of whom and in front of whom. And as we know and understand more and more about our audiences, particularly in the theatre sector, we know exactly who's coming and we know where they live because they buy tickets and they leave all kinds of data trails behind them. We can't pretend that we don't know who's missing from our audiences and from our institutions. And increasingly, I think I'm someone that is seeking to work with and engage those people who are not sat in the ticket buying audience of the institutions I've worked with. So in the last 10 years, I've worked with many artists I consider to be radical, fantastic live artists, choreographers, filmmakers and performance makers, but it has always been to follow them, to engage out in the world. So we've worked with Ursula Martinez, a cabaret artist with pensioners from Morecambe, and she worked with them for a year making a piece called OAP about the ageing body, but also her own practice, which is an explicit body-based live art practice. With A2 Company, we supported a process with local residents who created a ritual around their own death and a burying ritual that they performed in an art gallery. With Invisible Flock, we created a cross-bay walk across the treacherous Morecambe Bay, the quicksands in Morecambe, following Cedric Robinson, who is the last guide to those sands in Morecambe, while you listen to a sound piece of him talking about those 50 years crossing that bay and never leaving Morecambe. A piece that engaged with fishermen, with an industry that is coming to an end in that part of the coast, commercial fishing, which is almost finished. And indeed, Cedric's role, he's the last of the Queen's guides to the sands, and he retired last year, never to be replaced. So an interesting piece of social history. What's interesting for me in all those projects and others like them is the people that came, the people that attended, the people that went on those walks, that came to those shows, were genuine in an evidenced way, different from the ticket-buying public for the programme that I was putting together. So there's something really interesting about that. And I'll leave you with the final project that was the transformative one for me, which was in 2007, 2008. Having seen a lot less work because of my own circumstances with young children, I took a year out from programming, and we created a project where local residents programmed the Nuffield Theatre at that time where I was working. That was by far the most successful programme that theatre produced in the 10 years I was there. It doubled audiences from the year before, but it was also a fantastic programme of work. And I became not a programmer but a punter in my own venue again. And in fact, since that, I've never really gone back to programming in a traditional way. And indeed, Contact Theatre, where I work now, is somewhere where young people put the programme together. They make decisions about appointments, including my own. So my appointment was through a young person's panel, 2 young people on our board of trustees. And it is that engagement that delivers an audience which is 70% under 35, which for a theatre is a remarkable thing still. So that's my journey, I suppose.
Very good. Father of young children, I can relate to the idea of turning control over to the young people. They give us the illusion that we run the show, but not in fact. Kenrick.
Oh, okay. Feels like my journey is a bit different to everyone else's journey. I think for me, I have been that non-professional to professional artist. I started off dancing because it was something to do, because my best friend and my brother were doing it and it looked cool, it looked interesting, it looked exciting, so I just joined the club, literally. It wasn't something that I saw as a profession, it wasn't something I say I wanted this as my career. Again, it was it stimulated me. And for me, I was a basketball player. I thought dancing was for girls, so I was just quite ignorant at the time. But then understanding, the essence of b-boying, breakdancing, the hip-hop, the popping and locking, I started to understand certain formalities about how to become someone. Not even in the sense of a professional, but actually somebody, and how to express myself. And for me, my transition of, say, being a non-professional to a professional dancer was me going to an audition at Dance Attic for a girl group called Mystique. I don't know if anyone remembers Mystique. So I went to that audition, not knowing what was going to happen, and got the job. So the qualification wasn't necessarily there. It was more so the skill. So for me, when I'm working with, say, non-professional dancers, I'm not looking at their qualification. I'm looking at the skill. I'm looking at what is needed to create the piece of work. And I believe that during the process of creating that work, the mentality of professionalism comes into play. So it's a bit of a tricky situation, because for me, I believe I'm still finding my profession. I'm still finding my feet, as much as I've done a lot of professional work. And, with working with a lot of young people, our company works from the youngest of 4. You're seeing some talent that is on a different level to where we was at that age. So it's really about not only just trying to make them, or try to push the next generation to be those professional dancers. It's about also pushing this next generation to become the next set of people that's going to maybe lead the country, or be the next artistic directors or associate artists. And I think for us, it's about life skills. I think sometimes in any profession, life skills are very important. And in order to push other people, you yourself as an individual in your profession has to find a way to use your life skills to perfect your work. Because even from a creative point of view, like you were saying, them moments in your life is what creates the creativity within your head, the way for you to express yourself. So my general pursuit of happiness is not necessarily for me. My pursuit of happiness is a responsibility. So it's not necessarily I choose to work with non-professional artists. I feel it's my responsibility to work with non-professional artists to push them to that professional level. The question is, what is that professional level sometimes? Because I see some non-professionals being more professional than a professional. Quote.
Yeah.
So how do you measure professionalism? You know what I mean? For me, I see more the skill and what is needed.
Thank you for problematizing the notion which we thought we understood, which is always the beginning of a good discussion. Thanks, folks. If you're watching online, you've stumbled upon a live stream of an event that's taking place both in London and New York. And if you want to contribute, then the hashtag on Twitter is BODPOL14, BODPOL 14. Bless you, from the live audience in London. So we're going to switch across to New York, and first to hear from Julianne Stanza. Please go ahead.
Really, 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 so much. Thank you.
I don't think we're...
Are we here?
Yeah.
Are we here?
Yeah, you
are. We're here, okay. I'm so inspired by all of you. I want to begin by that. Thank you so much. What I find so amazing is when you see something unseeable in someone and it becomes seeable. I think this is what's happening very often when you're working with non-professional actors, dancers, people in general. And as a choreographer and a collaborator, the beauty of seeing an authenticity coming out of someone that perhaps never had a preconceived idea, maybe never had a work before that they did where their skill was having to be proven in some way, then you have a moment in their presence that perhaps is unforgettable. And when it's shown to a public, I think that's exactly the moment that a public can identify directly, quite directly, with this person. They can see themselves in this person. They can see that there's not anymore a boundary. between themselves and this person. And I think that's quite amazing, as with all the years I've worked with Pina and the company, that this is often what's coming across, that there's borders that are broken, that you can quite see that you are having people come to you and say, I know exactly how you felt, I know exactly what that's like. And I think the moment that we get this kind of a communication, and it's coming very, very obvious when we're working with non-professionals, I think we have taken a big step in humanity in that sense. I recently was asked the question, did I work with the Kontakthof group of seniors? Pina made Kontakthof also for the seniors in the year 2000. And one of the senior dancers, performers, got an injury to her knee. And I had to go into the production very suddenly, actually from the morning to the evening. And this was a moment where I must say that I was confronted more than ever with the authenticity of these people. They were quite older than I was, and I thought to myself, but they're probably wiser than I am. They've had so much experience. Are they dancers? Are they not dancers? Are they performers? No, they're human beings. And it made me really reflect on my own way of interpretation, of my own way of performing. And I was mostly sitting there through the whole performances, and then the other 3 performances after, quite in honor of who they were. And it changed my life, I must say.
Presumably they had to show you the moves as well, right, if you just learned that you were going on that morning?
A little bit. So with that, I must say that what's important, true, is what moves you is why you move. And that's the comment that Pina has left in my heart, I think, forever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julianne. And Simon?
Yeah. My view now is that after decades of what we call community arts experience and what the visual arts world calls social practice, artists are now working together with people, collaborators or participants, but in all kinds of ways. I really reject this idea of professional and non-professional. In a US context, it is almost meaningless if it's about being employed for your artistic practice. But because I think it's also based on a false premise. It's actually based on a very narrow idea of what performance skills are and the specific training or education that produces them. And I think rather than looking at the actual people who use those skills. So in dance and performance, my perception is that this idea of skills has been historically a huge controlling force that promotes and legitimizes a certain way of moving or a certain way of performing, and of course, by extension, legitimizes a certain body type that can execute that kind of skill or that way of moving. And I think this, of course, has developed a very exclusive practice and works against the very reality of diversity, the diversity that is human nature, human beings. So some commentators talk about this idea of contemporary practice as a de-skilling of performance, but I'd see it more as a politicization of practice. It's really a move to work with the whole person and all their abilities and experiences, and all the things that make them what they are, rather than just this idea of working with someone for a specific or very narrow set of a kind of skill set. A bit like a circus performer, it's really looking at how do you engage the whole being in the performance, which I think is now important. And skills, of course, have a tendency to want to be displayed, which of course can create a momentary wow factor in an onlooker or a spectator. But it's more because of the difficulty of the action rather than what that action is conveying or what it's saying in the context of the piece. So, for me, some of the autobiographical pieces of Jérôme Bel are good examples of this. He started with working with a Paris opera ballerina, Véronique Doisneau, and later there's a whole series working with Cédric Andria, who was with the Cunningham Company, or even Lutz Gregor, who was with the Pina Bausch Company. And really the work is about revealing the person behind the form, and a kind of deconstruction of what the form actually presents in terms of movement and the body. And I found them very powerful for that reason. I think this, what we might call then social practice approach, working with people through a process, often for a long period of time, shifts the notion of what the artist is from a producer of things or events, which of course can be bought or consumed, into a facilitator, someone who creates an experience, who generates relationships, who sets up a process that people kind of go through. And I think this is also an implicit critique of art as a consumable commodity. It's actually about positioning it as an experiential process, and even something that is lifelong, something that people can experience from that moment and continue to do so. It builds who they are and what they are. So I'll finish by just saying because there's a big question about why people pay money for this, and I think people buy into this process, whether you're seeing it or you're participating in it. You spend your time or you spend your money. But I think for the participant, the person who's involved in that process, the potential impact on their view of the world, and of course their view of themselves in relation to that, is huge. And I would cite as an example Rosemary Lee's Square Dances, which Dance Umbrella presented in 2011. Someone's nodding in the audience, that's good, you saw it. So this was a piece where, by working with people who live in these residential squares in London over an extended period of time, she created, of course, a piece which people could come and see. So there was a sharing there, but actually those who participated in the process were able to work not only in terms of the community that they were a part of, but building new relationships, but also creating a piece around who they are and the values that they held. And I think the power of that experience really cannot be quantified, and certainly not given a monetary value. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Shall we have a round of applause for those interventions? I just want to pick up immediately on that point that Simon left us with, where things can't be quantified and it's not about monetary value. And I hope you'll all forgive me for asking what may be a naive but also a direct question. Isn't the difference between a professional performer and someone who isn't a professional performer the question of whether they're being paid to do it or not? I mean, Simon, you said that this distinction was unimportant, but presumably, if you are the person who either is or isn't getting paid, it could be quite important. I don't know whether you want to come straight back before we return to London, Simon.
Yeah, can I just say, I mean, it's not that it's unimportant, it's just that if you define professionalism by being paid for the work that you do, and by that I mean, a fair wage for the time and effort you invest in a project, then in a United States context, that really is almost meaningless, because a lot of people are participating in art projects because they volunteer to do so, even if they have gone through a huge amount of performance training prior to that. So the economy that supports artistic practice and your desire or your investment in making a work are completely out of balance with each other. And
Julianne, I suppose in the piece, I'm curious still literally as to whether when you stepped in that day or that evening with the seniors, were you getting paid and they weren't? You don't have to answer this question if it's indiscreet.
I think all were properly, all properly got what they needed.
Very good.
Yes, we were all getting paid, of course.
Okay. Good. And I promise we'll get to more elevated topics in a minute, but just let's keep on the money for the performers for a moment.
But I really don't think that in that sense
your perspective on this?
I think that's a really interesting question for me, but many of the artists that we've worked with, or that I've worked with, take it as a political question. Pay, let's not call them participants, but to pay the artists that they're working with. Quarantine, British company who are fantastic, did a piece with us called White Trash with young men, and they wanted to pay them because it shifted how that project was perceived both by the audience and the young people. We're currently doing a piece with young female Muslim amateur boxers with the company called Commonwealth, and again the company have decided to pay those young women who are between 16 and 19 because they're collaborators, they're the artists, and they're co-creating this piece. So it's an important decision for an artist to make, I think, about whether their collaborators are paid.
And I promise we're not going to get an answer from every panellist on every question that arises, but on this one I am going to go through yours. So Penny, I mean, would you like to say, in projects that you do, the young people, the subjects you're working with, are you paying them to participate in the project?
Well, for example, the two films that I mentioned, One Day, which was a fiction, people were paid because they were acting, they weren't doing what they would have done anyway that day. So they're working, we were all getting paid, absolutely, you pay people. So anything that's a fiction, I pay people. When it came to the second film, which was the documentary, I didn't pay people, and I think that's really important because otherwise we would have been bribing people to say that they weren't going to be in the gang or they weren't going to kill people or whatever, and that feels to me wrong because actually what we're doing there is we're not filming people doing, you know, something that I have asked them to do, and if they don't want to turn up, they don't turn up, and if they don't want to say something, they don't say it. And so I think where you put money into that equation, it becomes ethically very difficult. And I think in these sort of formatted, well, they're not really documentaries where people are really mocked and made fools of and paid money to be idiotic. That's what they're being paid for, and actually that's more of a performance, really. So I would make that distinction. But absolutely, if you're asking people to come and work, you have to pay them.
Right. So your distinction then between paying and not paying is whether what people are doing is a fiction or whether it's, as it were, themselves.
Yes. Yeah.
In a sense, you were the one who raised this whole question by trying to weaken the notion of professional and non-professional.
Yeah.
How does it cash out in your experience?
Oh, okay. You get the famous line, "This work will give you good exposure." You get that a lot.
And that doesn't just mean you have to take your clothes off to be in the show.
Well, you know, and sometimes, you know, when you are, as a dance crew or a dance company, you know, you are trying to push yourself out for people to see you so that you are aiming to get the jobs, the paid jobs, the bigger things. I think sometimes it depends on the size of the work, and also I think there's a certain process. If the young people are coming to a rehearsal or a training session, then they're paying a certain amount of subs for that class, for that session to be trained. So you're not going to pay them to get trained. If there's a job, a corporate gig, yes, they should be paid. If they're doing backing dancing for an artist, yes, they should be paid. But in this day and age, you know, especially with the whole commercial music scene, budgets have gone down so bad that it's come to a point where, you know, what would be classified as standard rehearsal is now, you know, they're trying to get 3 or 4 rehearsals for one day rate. So it's getting very hard to, you know, it's all, I think it's about your value. When you get to a certain level with your skills and with your qualification, you have to start to now hustle your value and make sure that you stay true to yourself so that if something does feel like, you know what, I can volunteer to do that job because it is quite good for the exposure right now and I'm not doing anything right now, then maybe that can work. But then sometimes you have to hold your corner and say, no, I won't do that.
And I think we will come back to the politics of the processes we're doing and so on. But I still just want to top out this particular question. I'm happy in New York. I think you may need to wave if you feel particularly moved to comment. But is there a moral or a political dimension to this question? Because I know certainly in this country and perhaps also in the States, there's been quite a lot of political pressure to get companies not to take unpaid interns, for example, and it's become quite a live political issue. In Europe, there's huge amounts of youth unemployment, and, you know, I just wonder if there is a moral element here or a political one on this very question of whether people are paid before we get into the arts. Does anyone want to pick up on that?
I mean, as Simon was sort of, I think, alluding to, most of us as artists do a lot of unpaid work. I certainly do, you know. And the amount of ideas that you have and the amount of projects that actually get funded, you know. I mean, sometimes people see me and they think that I'm sort of rolling in it. I have a mortgage and I could paper my house with rejections, you know. And so there's a sense in which all of us actually we do because it's work that we love. But I think in terms of how we make work, once there's a budget, then that budget can't be sort of just allocated to the people who've done it before. You know, if you're working, you're working. So I think if you haven't got a budget, then I guess you have to, you know, we all can make that decision that you said, you know, to decide whether it's worth your while or not.
We're developing visual semantics on the fly, Simon. So when I go like that, it means I've seen you waving. Go on, Simon, please.
No, I just want to say I think there's clearly a moral issue about paying people for their labor.
Yeah.
But the bigger issue, I think, is a political one, which is often that if you imagine work that only gets made because an external agency or even individual in the US context deems it appropriate to fund it, then there's also a very narrow range of work that gets made. And I think it's important, if people feel the urgency to kind of create something, they will create the context, the engagement with people that makes it happen.
Yeah.
And that applies actually across the board. And it's important we don't rely on external monetary sources to determine what we do or what we don't do.
Yeah, go on, Jen.
And at the same time, I think it's very important that we have people that are capable to pull out the potential of politicians and art institutions, to pull their potential out, to be interested. So therefore that little bit of mediation is fantastic when you have those kind of people there who can say, and they make good publicity in a way. I recently have been working with a group of disabled professionals, let's say, in Italy, and they are now, it's called the Academy of Art of Diversity, and they've just gotten the funding that they each get 500 euros a month for their work in making all the collaborations and all of the professional performances that we do. And they are a wonderful group of well-diverse artists and dancers, and it's phenomenal to have gotten that kind of subsidy. And I believe that it gives them another state of life, another state of mind, another virtue, another awareness of themselves, being able to be paid. And I know that they're aware of it.
Now, I mean, I think both Matt and Penny have described this in their opening remarks, and Simon, you alluded to it, which is the political resonance of this kind of work. And I suppose, you know, as artists, we all want to change the world, potentially, but I wonder whether there's something particular about working with non-professional participants in your work, which fits better with trying to change political situations or situations outside the artistic construct. So Penny, you talked about the outcomes in terms of murders and so on. Is it easier to change the world, to have a political effect from your work when you're working with non-professional participants than professionals?
That's a big question.
Is part of why you work, that's why you work the way you do, because you want to change the world?
Not really.
Okay.
Or if you do, I think you need to try and forget that that's what you're trying to do. Because in any individual project, as a curator or a programmer, you're talking to an artist who has got a hunch or a frustration or an itch or a concept even in which they want to engage. They don't just want to work in a black box studio. They want to deal with an idea or a connection. And then our job is to support them through that and to put together the structures by which that's possible and to help them engage with the people they want to meet with. So I'm constantly finding myself in that facilitative role that Simon talks about. And I also think the same about artistic leadership now, much less about an artistic director with a vision or an idea or even an enthusiasm that they want to see written in their institution. It's about a facilitation of the conversation between artists and audiences and contexts and participants that becomes the programme. And that, for me, feels a political position to be in, actually, and an interesting one that might, if you want to be highfalutin, stand some chance of creating dialogue that might change some people's world.
But it's not foregrounded in the goals of what you're doing in that sense?
I think it's quietly political. I mean, the work that certainly that I'm engaged with, I would say, is political and is trying to change and affect change. But the key thing for me is to affect how people feel about their ability to affect change in their own lives or their own communities. Their sense that through this project they have agency and can make something happen is very powerful in unpredictable ways.
Penny, did you mention these outcomes because it's something you're looking for as a result of your work, or is it just something you've observed by the by?
No, it's more something I've observed by the by. I start with a question usually, and I want to know, I want to find something out, I'm really curious. I don't start with the answer. And then what seems to happen very often is that some seismic change can emerge from it. But I don't think you can start doing that, because usually then that's not very good work, because you're imposing an idea on something rather than letting it come out of the work that you're doing. So I think there has to be a sort of passion and authenticity, which was the word that Julia was using. I think it's really important, rather than, it's not a lecture, you're actually making art, and if you want to do something else, become a politician or write a book,
Was that me?
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to extend the conversation a little bit, because, what Matt describes, I think, is admirable practice, but in a sense, the critique that is implied is of the very spaces and buildings and the kind of infrastructure we've built to present performance to a public. And what this work is doing is completely deconstructing both the value of, the theatre building itself, and this idea of people who will, make their evenings free, find time to buy a ticket, arrange the babysitter, and be there at 7:30. It's a very bizarre thing that we've established as a historic way of engaging with performance. And I think this work starts to critique all of those assumptions about where performance happens, why, what time it happens, who's there. And I think we need to be really rethinking the kinds of infrastructures that we are building to support cultural development.
But can I ask then explicitly to any of you, I think there are two central questions here. Why would the artist want to do this kind of work, and what would the value be for the audience? And on the second of those questions, which I think is partly implicit in what you're saying, Simon, what is the value for an audience of seeing work which contains non-professionals? Are we expecting them to view the work differently? Are we expecting them to feel differently about themselves as audience, simply because some of the people on stage are, in some sense, non-professional? Julianne?
I think I think they'll live the moment. I think that all those things you're saying will be eliminated if the authenticity, as I used the word before, or as we see something seeable, if we see someone being moved or being in the moment of executing something, all those things that you're saying aren't there. And you identify yourself with someone that's there in front of you. And you're able to go along with the story, or the way they're moving, or the look in their eyes, as if it's your own. We're suddenly community. We're suddenly related. There's no more the difference between I'm in the chair as a public and you're performing for me. There's a oneness that happens. And I've lived this again and again and again. As if to say, not everybody's a dancer, but we all can dance. Not everybody can write a poem, but we all have poetry within us. And we can see that all in different ways.
Penny, you're nodding.
Yeah, so I really agree with everything that you're saying. The first time I ever cast someone who hadn't done it before, for a first-time actor, was a woman who I'd written a part for, who'd had 10 children. And we're talking about the body politic. Having 10 children does things to your body. And I really didn't believe that any, graduate from RADA would look as if they'd had 10 children and lived the kind of life that she'd had, eating the food that she'd eaten and having very bad teeth as a result of abuse and so on. And so she was able to play a version of herself better than anyone else. So the choice was made for that, not because I don't think that actors are good actors, So I think each time you make the choice of what's the best way of telling the story. And the audience that comes will decide whether it speaks to them and they feel that it's wonderful or it isn't.
What's the Marathon Man story with Dustin Hoffman and Laurence Olivier, where he's playing a marathon runner and he gets up every morning at 4 and comes in his tracksuit to the set. He goes, "My God, what happened? I've been up since 4 and And Olivier goes, "You should learn to act, dear boy. It's far less tiring." And so is it the case that there are some roles which you can get people to act, and other roles where you need the real thing? As a director, are you sort of making that kind of choice to get to the authentic?
You see, I really object to the term real thing, because I just think everything is real, isn't it? Everything is real. So you're just choosing the right person for that particular part that you want. So I don't think that you're not discarding people. Each time you're just making the best work that you can make.
Henrik's nodding now. Do you want to come in on that point?
Oh, okay. Yep. I think for me, I find a lot of non-professional dancers are constantly training, constantly pushing themselves to take themselves to the next level. And sometimes professional dancers are quite content with where they are in their life, and when the job comes, they do what they need to do. And you know, if it's 10 till 6, they'll do 10 till 6. Most non-professional dancers, it's their life, and they continuously push themselves. They go into places like South Bank or Charing Cross, or to a dance studio, or down to a shopping centre to constantly be training in their art. So when you're looking at, you know, the realness of it, the rawness of it, sometimes the professionals have kind of not taken that into account. They kind of stepped away from what originally they might have come from. So for me, you know, like what you're saying, when you're trying to make the best piece of work, for me, I want the realness, I want the rawness, I want those who are going to push that extra mile and take the work to the next level.
I do want to come back, if I may, though, Matt, to this point, because there is a sense from what Julianne is saying that you know, the question of whether people are professional or not becomes like a program note. It's something you can look, you know, over drinks afterwards, but it's lost in the moment of the performance and the authenticity that arises. But I do have a sense, Matt, in the way that you set up the operation that you have, that the question of where people come from and what their relationship with theatre was before they turned up that day is critical. And so how do you square that? Do you want to let go of where people are from and it's just about the authentic moment? Or is there really a point about saying this is something that anybody could be a part of?
Well, I mean, I still work in an institution, and I'm still in an institutional role, and I kind of check my privilege about that. But it's interesting to me that, you know, the vast majority of the work that I've developed has not been within the institution that I've been working in. It's a strategy, I think, that both artists and programmers increasingly have, which is to get out there and meet people, and then 9 times out of 10 the project tends to then take place in a community or in the street or in a found site or in a derelict building, or it engages with people through their work. And increasingly I'm finding ways and projects that have engaged with you know, people that through their job have come to the project, or have come to it through where they live in the city or through their hobby. So we did a piece with Louise Ann Wilson that worked with bird watchers and the RSPB, and that became a performance walk, a dance performance on the cliffs. But actually what got the audience there and the participants there was the love of that landscape and bird watching. But actually that got a completely different audience than would have come to a contemporary dance performance by that same choreographer within the institution at 8 o'clock in the dark, and all of those, you know, with all the barriers around that.
I'm curious then, in New York, about this question of where the work is taking place. I mean, is that part of the story there? Because the framing of it in a conventional theatre will be the framing in a conventional theatre. Do you think there's an interaction with the place where it takes place as well?
Absolutely.
Sure. I've done things outside, inside, on the sea. The workshops I make are sometimes on the sea with the rocks, and you do your solo by the rocks. Maybe you go in the sea, maybe you go into the dunes. That can happen too. But I'd like to just switch one second back to your question about, well, again, our theme, non-professionality, professionality. I want to say to all the ballet dancers, the opera singers, all of the actors that have gone through so much time in preparing themselves. As I've been a ballet dancer for so many years, there is the place. And doing Balanchine ballets, you need to have the technique. And let's just give that the credit it deserves in this discussion, because that's also very important. So, back to where...
but I think we can carry on with that point, because I think, you know, it's clear in almost any dance style that the dedication of having done it for that many years is going to be important.
Yeah. And I think the public that goes to see that wants to also see that, and that's totally legitimate.
But it's why, you know, we started off by, or at least I did, rejecting this professional, non-professional binary. I mean, it's who are the performers and why are they there? What do they bring to it?
Right.
And then you apply that, of course, to whatever you're looking at, and the appropriateness of those performers and what they bring to that performance is what the audience is engaging with. And that's why we need to see performers coming from a huge, broad diversity of context, because that's what life is, and artists are working with that material. So I think we just talk about who's the performer, how did they get there, what do they bring to it, and then we don't have, and of course we pay them, but of course, you know, we don't have this issue of are they professional, what training do they have? Because I think that training idea is really the misnomer. You know, it's have you had a very specific training and for what? and are you then using it appropriately? But I wanted to go back to context, because I think the place where something happens has a huge impact on the experience itself. And the more you can have a relationship between the location, the context of that location, the time of day, all of those things, and the relationship between the event and the audience is a critical part of the content of the piece. And all too often, I mean, I've just spent 5 years in higher education, training dance students in their higher education program. They all assume, or they come with an assumption, that what they're doing is making work for a proscenium theatre, as if that's a sort of neutral space. It's not neutral at all. It's loaded with assumptions about values, about hierarchies, and I think we need to deconstruct all of that and engage with the piece in relationship to the place it's in, as much as who's on stage or in the space working and performing.
Very good. Talking of people being in spaces and working and performing, we have an audience here. Folks, we'll try and get mics to you if you have a question. If you want to do it from upstairs or you don't get the mic, I'll repeat the question. But does anyone want to come in with a comment or question on what we've heard so far? And we can also call upon the Twitter sphere to share their wisdom. Yeah, there's a lady there with a hand up.
I have a question. Should I stand up or can I sit down?
You can stand up. Why don't you stand up?
I was recently working in Korea on a project where we used locals to make a piece of performance artwork. And my question is to do with the psychological distancing from the participants with your films. But I wonder if you find difficulties using that kind of personas in your work, because I found it quite challenging working with people who had direct experience with the issue and the things we were kind of dealing with.
What's the challenge? Can you give us one more thing? Why is it difficult working with people who experience the thing which the piece is about?
We were working with locals who had been victims of the Gwangju BNR, not the Gwangju, what's it called? The Gwangju demonstrations. And I found it quite emotional to see those victims actually embody some of the movements that we were using that they had been a victim of 20 years ago.
So you were unable to draw on professional distance from the participants?
Yes.
Penny, actually, yeah.
I don't have professional distance at all, and it can be really painful. And I don't even know whether I should share this now, but this was actually...
It's only these guys and the internet watching Penny.
Well, it's really for respect for
it's going to be
woman.
Available to watch again also afterwards. So.
Well, I'm still going to say but I'm afraid you will feel a bit sad about laughing, because I made a film about homeless people, and I became very close to a woman I was following who was very traumatized, and I've stayed in touch with her for 5 years because actually I don't feel it's right to cut off. And she set herself on fire on Friday and is in intensive care. And because she doesn't know anybody else really who's consistent in her life, she's put me as her next of kin, even though she doesn't, she, in some ways, for me, quite a very, very small part of my life. But I'm now having calls from the hospital asking whether or not it's all right to do certain procedures. So you are holding people's lives in your hand, and it takes a great big chunk out of your heart and sometimes out of theirs. So although the outcomes, say, when I was making these gang films, the fear was that somebody would be killed because I had naively said, oh yes, I'll help you do a truce, without knowing anything about it. And it was possible at certain times that I would be killed, and I have had guns pulled on me, but the likelihood really is very, very small. It was much more likely that one of the young guys who trusted me would be killed, and that kind of response, it keeps you awake at night, and it's so there's a high cost to pay on all sides from making these decisions.
And I don't mean to be in any way glib in framing what you were saying that way, and clearly it's part of the power of your work that there is this kind of authenticity to your participation in the situations you're filming. How do you protect yourself, though? And I mean, this is a question I can generalise out, because when you're pulling down the barriers in that sort of way, you become much more vulnerable as a practitioner yourself, right?
Yeah. And I don't really know how to answer that question because I don't really protect myself very well. And I think that if you're a person in an institution, you're working in a prison or you're working in a psychiatric hospital, you have a massive network of people and counsellors and so on, and people who will support you, who understand. If you're working as an artist, you've got nothing. But you can do things that nobody else can do. I can hang around with people talking about crimes, and I don't need to report them because I'm not working for the police, you know, and therefore there's a certain kind of trust. All there is between me and the people I'm working with is trust, nothing else.
Does this chime with you guys over there, this kind of vulnerability sense? Because, I mean, I think, you know, if you're opening up your practice in this sort of way, some of the things that you can take for granted when you're solely working in a professional context fall by the wayside. I don't know, Julianne or Simon, whether you want to.
I would like to just go back to what Penny said, because I think that protection, I mean, if I can be so honest, let me be honest. The protection that you have is your conviction, and the protection you have is what moves you. And what moves you is why you're doing it. And I think the risk, if I can use that word, that you take is a chance for all of us. Thank you. Penny.
Do you want to come in on that, Kenry?
I find when you're working with a lot of young people, some of them have you know, maybe domestic situations at home, and sometimes you're the only one that they can actually speak to because you've put that time into them when you're training, when you're rehearsing. Sometimes they may come into a rehearsal and they have no money. So literally, okay, I'll get, so, you know, there's some of them hang around at the studio after hours. Why are you still here? And they may not say anything, but sometimes it's because they just don't want to go home. So as a human being, all you want to do is just help a next fellow human being. You're not looking at the dance or the art anymore, or the profession. You're just looking at someone needs my help. So you're not really, there's not really a sense of protection. Like you're saying, it's that conviction. It's what you humanly feel. It's morale. It's like what you feel you need to do and how you're going to push this person. Because once they do become successful, you know you've not helped them in their profession, you've helped them in their life. And regardless whether or not they decide to maintain a dance career or a profession, they may take them life skills that you've helped push them through their dance to becoming the next general manager of a retail shop or the next architect. But they've had that moment to express themselves and become something more powerful, you know?
Thank you. Any more from the floor? Gentleman there. We'll get the mic to you, sir. Folks, if you're online watching on the Twitter sphere, hello again. This is live from BAM in New York and from King's College London, and you can tweet with the hashtag BODPOL14. BODPOL14. Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, hi. It really follows on from the same point. I had a friend who was telling me about a dance project where they were taking some young people, marginalized communities, giving them some quite professional support using a professional choreographer and going through quite a professional process, and by all accounts got quite a well-received result. But at the end of the process, they kind of left, and he felt that actually the people who were participating actually had been given a glimpse of a different possibility of a world that they just were then sort of gone back to their normal lives, and he felt that they were actually could be worse off than they had been before. And I wondered if somebody would like to talk about that, the social responsibilities of the artistic practice.
Well, it sounds like not an advertisement for doing this kind of work, chaps. Matt, would you advise? I mean,
that point resonates for me really, really strongly, because I don't, you know, as an artist that's in projects, when it ends, it's actually, there's a huge space and an emptiness that opens in your life, and if that is the first time you've engaged in that powerful connection with artists and other people in the community, when that goes, is a huge issue. The Ursula Martinez project I spoke about became 2 more projects directly out of that gap. So the pensioners that worked with Ursula, immediately then we realised we had to continue to engage with them, and we created a project called Relative, with those grandparents and their grandchildren, which the dancer Nicky McCretton made. And then from that we made Morecambe Dances, which was again a third project, so it's probably in total about 5 years, but much of that was a kind of hastily put together exit plan because we realised how strong that connection had been. The other issue that you make me think about it also is how the work is received, and the work can be spoken about and written about and responded to by critics, by audiences, and indeed by the friends and family of the people in the work in ways that can be quite shocking and very unexpected for the participants. And again, how you wrap that around with some support and discussion is a really big issue.
Do you want to come in New York on that one? Or, I mean, it does occur to me that there's a question about this kind of work, which it feels to me as if it's almost like a career level choice. This doesn't feel to me like the kind of, from the way you talk about it, Matt, the kind of way of working that you could choose to do for one project or two and then switch a kind of standard script-based in a theatre thing readily. Does it feel like you have to commit your life to this way of working? Simon, has that been your experience?
Well, it's to do with this whole relationship between project-based support and looking at something that is really almost a long-term, lifelong process. And it comes back to my critique of cultural institutions. I think it's important that we find different ways in which we can embed artists within society, in communities, in places where they can be both fed by being there, but also feed that community in the way that they engage with them and create the work. And I think it's really important on not putting any pressure on Matt, but on all of us, including Matt, that we find ways in which we can find long-term ways of embedding artists in society. It's a way of removing ourselves from this sway of project funding, this stop-start approach to working, it's happening. It's beginning to happen with people finding different economic bases on which they can support artistic activity. But I think it's beholden to us to really work to find new ways to make that happen. That artists can be for a long time in a community working in a continuous way, and that's. I think it's critical for the way we as a society engage with the arts, but also about how we position the artist in the world. I think they're increasingly important in helping us articulate and dialogue around what it is to be human and what it is to live in this world.
And now, articulation and dialogue is not something which we always associate with Twitter, but Alice, do you want to tell us what's been going on there in response to our discussion?
Indeed, there's been lots of questions coming in online, which is great.
We'll hear a bunch of them and then I'll try and redirect them to the panel, if that's efficient, Alice. Yeah.
Great. There's been quite a few around this topic of what defines artistic quality in participatory work. A question from Marguerite: does professional training kill authenticity? But then I also like to highlight some questions about the audience. So we had one saying, should audiences be made aware that non-professional artists are involved in or performing? Why or why not? And secondly, what is the value of non-professional performers from the audience's perspective? We'll keep with those for now.
That sounds like a good list. The quality one, I think, is super interesting, right? So we've all seen terrible work which was produced by people who were very well paid to do it. So it's clearly not the case that being professional is a guarantee of anything. But do we have to think about curatorial approaches or quality bars differently in a context where we're working with non-professional, or is that a really insulting question? Does anyone want to pick that one up, that quality question?
Can I start?
Yeah, go for it, Simon.
Only because it comes back to this idea that you're making a product that someone's going to buy and therefore attach a certain kind of monetary value to. I think we need to see this as a process where the value is to all those people who are participating, as well as if there is a final project at the end that people can see, that's then kind of viewable and has some kind of monetary value to it. But I think the idea of quality is one of expectation from someone who's coming to either participate or see the work. What are they expecting to see, and therefore what kind of value added elements, whether it be set and costumes, are they thinking is there? And this relationship between the intention of the work and how clearly that intention is communicated through the piece itself. So I think where you're talking about quality is, for me, the ability for an audience to read the intentionality of the artist and the performers. If there's clarity around that, then I think you have a very valuable experience, and your notion of quality is achieved. But I think it has to be.
Would it help the audience to read the intentionality if they're told whether the participants are professional or not? That was another question that we come to, because it feels to me as if you. Yeah.
They'll know. I mean, the reason they're going is because of what the piece is and who's involved in it. You don't have people very rarely do you turn up in a community hall for a show that you've not got no information about. So I think it's a slightly misleading question. People know who is performing and what the show is, and of course there's a whole infrastructure to make sure that communication is clear and informed. But I don't think it's clear.
So Julianne, do you think you need to think differently about quality when you're working with professional and non-professional participants?
I just wanted to add that I think it's possible for people to walk out of a theater if they do not like what they're seeing, if they feel uncomfortable, if they feel like it's not tonight, that's what they want. They have that option. For example.
People switching off their live streams all across the world. Thank you, Simon, for that beautiful piece of theatre.
I must say, I do bring the story of Dance Theatre Wuppertal, because in the early days where Pina was doing her great works, people were leaving the theatre. I've been on the stage where you see people leaving, and I think that that's absolutely possible. And I don't think that if they leave or they don't leave is based on if there's a professional or non-professional on the stage.
Okay. Does anyone else on the other ones?
I think it shouldn't matter, because either the work speaks to you or it doesn't. And there is also good and bad work, but we disagree as to what that is, you know. And the thing that I'm wanting to slightly...
So everybody who watches your stuff knows the way it was made, and that's
not necessarily.
So they don't need to be made aware of that.
Very often people are very surprised. In fact, I get that all the time, that people haven't done it before. So and that pleases me, because actually the performance is really good, and people who don't like it are not saying they don't like it because the actors are first time. They just, they're not interested in those kind of portrayals. But I also think that, this idea that somehow we're the artists that have to be embedded and we're taking jewels to the people, sometimes that's not the case, because the thing that interested me in the first place was walking past groups of boys around a bike, battle rapping, and I was thinking, what are they doing? It's so interesting. So actually you go into places, it's an encounter. So I'm not going in there taking art to the people. I'm taking what I know, but I'm encountering levels of sophistication in terms of language and performance that are completely breathtaking. So actually it works both ways.
You made the remark earlier about your qualification is skilled. So for you, the question of quality in the sense of involving non-professional participants?
I think as a company, there's an expectation of your work, regardless of whether there's professionals or non-professionals on stage delivering the work that you're putting on. And for us, sometimes, we may have professional dancers, and sometimes we have non-professional dancers. Either way.
Do you tell people?
No, because it's work. I believe that when you tell them that, you're going to give them the choice of, do I really want to come and watch non-professionals? And I don't think that should be a question. I think the work is there. The synopsis has been put out. This is what the work is about. Come and see it. If you're open-minded, come and see your work. Come and see my work or your work or his work. It's not about the people on stage, because, you will find a gem amongst these non-professionals that people be like, who was that person? Who was that? I've never seen that person before. So...
Matt, I'm distracted by New York chaps. If we were in a classroom, I'd say, do you want to share with the rest of the class what you're saying over there? But do you want to come in with something before I ask Matt about...
Oh, no, I was just saying it would be great in the show if we all wore a T-shirt saying how much we're being paid for that performance. Then you can relativize your expectations.
Great idea. Yeah.
And then a T-shirt, how much you would like to be paid, or what you would like to be paid.
That'll be on the back.
What you've done until now.
Right. Matt, is it... Now, I don't know if community theatre is a phrase that you would like to use, but I just, informally, community theatre has often been associated with lower quality theatre. In that, is that a fair comment? And how does that relate to what you're doing? Is quality important in how you produce stuff?
No, I would never call it community theatre or engagement or outreach or participation, and none of the artists that I've worked with speak in those terms about their work. They're making great art, or they're trying to make great art that speaks to people or is made with people. Rimini Protocol have got a nice phrase which is about the experts of everyday life, and everyone is an expert in something, and when you can tap into what they're expert in, their performances are full of brilliance and nuance and interest and meaning. And some artists are just very interested in tapping into that. So for me, personally, it's a non-question. I would certainly not go, oh, and this is the local kind of participant part of the programme, and here's the professional part, and we charge differently for it. And it's very clearly framed. The piece we're doing in a gym in Moss Side next week, young Muslim boxers, that is the concept of the show. That's who they are. You come and see them boxing, and while they're boxing, they talk about their lives. That's what it is. That's what you engage with, and they're experts at both boxing and their own lives. So the idea of skill or quality is just not relevant in that.
We're going to go to the floor on the Twitter sphere. First to Twitter, Alison, and then there'll be a question from the balcony, which I will relay to the world afterwards. Alice, do you want to...
There's another question for Matt again. I think earlier you mentioned about following on projects. Someone was saying, how do these follow-on projects get funded? Is social responsibility a question of artists' willingness or money?
Yeah, do you want to do that one quickly? Can you get...
Yeah, so the only way I've been able to work in the way I have is because I've worked at regularly funded organisations that have 3 or 5 year plans and funding agreements. That's why we've been able to do, I was able to do 10 years of projects in a very small part of Morecambe because I was funded in that way. So that's a specific...
Simon's point to the funding structures.
Yeah.
Well, then give us your question from up there, and I promise I'll give a version of repeating it. Go on. Well, do it short. Yeah. So we're going to come back to who the participants are and what we call them. So the question of whether artists should be labelled differently when they're doing social action than social workers should, or yeah. Yeah, go on.
Long histories of aesthetics, values, processes, movement agendas that are different from professional art.
I'm going to stop you there, but that's a really useful point. So there are community art or dance traditions which are distinct from, I think, what we're talking about, but I'm going to take that as a question to you, whether community dance traditions are different from involving non-professional participants in, as it were, the production of art. If there's anyone wants to do another quick intervention, then I'm going to do a quick sweep round to finish up. Man, do you want to pass the microphone to you can take the mic and use it. Yeah.
I was just going to go on the back of that because I recently had a conversation that the term community actually devalues what you're doing. It wasn't personally my opinion, it was someone else's. I was quite surprised. Because it does come down to how you determine and define what community means. It might be that you're just working in that context. What's a group of people? They come together. Do they become a community through a piece of work, or is it that you've gone into a context saying, I'm going to do something that's grassroots community based because I've come from a potentially high art background, or will do something different? And how you define it, because Matt said quite strongly, oh no, it's not necessarily community based, but how do you define it then? What are we doing? It seems like we're moving quite far away from exclusion, but...
Very good. We're going to wrap with a couple of sentences from each of you. We'll go in the reverse order than you spoke originally, which puts you in the hot seat, Simon, so you have to stay seated for this bit. So there are questions about who are these participants, I guess, would be one thing, but you should feel free to say anything in your closing remarks that you like.
Yeah, no, what I wanted to do was respond to the question on the balcony that we couldn't really hear enough, but is to do with this difference between making art and doing social work, and I think that's, again, a completely false definition. We are working with artists who are making art in a whole range of different contexts, and of course it has a social value and it has a developmental value for the people who are involved and the communities it's in, but then so does any kind of artistic practice and any kind of performance. So I think it's critical that we don't distinguish work that happens in a sort of mainstream cultural institution as art and everything else is social work. It's actually art. And I think what we've really been saying through the discussion is that these artistic practices are morphing and changing and becoming more and more connected to the worlds we all inhabit. And we need to be very open to seeing artists working in all those different contexts and regarding it as equitable, whether it's in a community hall, in a public park, in an old building or a theatre. It's art and we engage with it as such.
Thank you for that really important point, and I must say that any misrepresentation of the question is entirely my own fault, but I think it's a very helpful remark, Simon. Thank you. Julianne.
I just think that it's important to understand what is therapy, what is wanting to express yourself, what is art, which we're all searching for, and that I think those differences are there.
Thank you.
To be seen and to be experienced. Because very oftentimes working with people with diverse capacities, one would think is bringing dance, is bringing someone to make a movement of yearning or desire, a therapy for them. No, they're giving themselves the chance to express themselves in maybe their deepest way. And if you want to call that art, then let's call it art. If we want to call that need, if we need to give money and finance that, those are all questions we need to understand, that it is a part of our lives. And if we go back to history, artists, interesting how art was starting. Artists were in the courtyard. Artists were maybe not, they were the next door neighbor. We were all artists, let's say, to speak. And it's only, I think, in how we've evolved as a society that these divisions have become so strong and so encaging.
Thank you, Julianne. Escape the cage. Kenrick.
I would say just because I may help someone by buying them a bottle of water does not make me a social worker. I'm just helping someone. You know, I'm just helping that dancer because they didn't have the money to get the bottle of water. Like what the lady was saying on the balcony, I think the labels are starting to create a bit of a blur with regards to, you know, what is right, what is wrong, what is, you know what I mean? And I think sometimes it really creates a blur sometimes. For me personally, I'm just doing my thing. I'm just dancing, I'm just creating, I'm just trying to make things happen. And if you're with me, we're going to try and make it happen, you know? So sometimes it's a bit hard to kind of go, yeah, it's this, it's that. No, let's just make a bit of work, let's express ourselves, let's be happy, and let's heal the world. Simple, no?
So not too much responsibility there, man.
I think it feels like a really interesting, exciting time to be making work and programming work and seeing it, because all these boundaries are blurring between professional and amateur, between non-institution, between art forms and what is and isn't art and what is and isn't everyday life. And I think that's really rich territory, but for any artist it's a choice about where you seek to position or make your work within all of that. It's a choice, but it does feel like a really exciting and interesting time in all of those contradictions and blurs in which to engage and to make interesting art and get people in front of it.
Thank you. Penny.
Well, I think everybody's expressed themselves so beautifully. I feel I've hardly anything to say really, but I suppose for me, making art, it's like breathing, and if I don't breathe I can't survive. And some of the people, if I'm making work, people who haven't done it before might decide that they want to define themselves as artists, not just in the moment that they've been working with me. And then you have to say it's a very rocky road and you have to be more than slightly insane to embark on it, but it's open to everyone.
Thank you very much. much, Penny. So, folks, you can see a version of this on the Dance Umbrella website straight away, and on Dance UK TV's website shortly afterwards as well. This has been a collaboration. We're very grateful to BAM in Brooklyn, to Dance UK, to Dance Umbrella, and Cultural Institute at King's. I think it just remains for me to thank our speakers, Simon Dove, Julianne Stanza, Henrik Sandy, Matt Benton, and Penny Woolcock. And thanks to all of you for being here and for watching in Podworld. Thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah.